Team, welcome to something new that we are trying, which is creating video content to accompany blog posts. And that's not to necessarily take away from the blog posts themselves, but rather to add a little bit more nuance, maybe a little bit more context, some substance to what you might simply read. So, a couple of weeks ago, about a month ago, I posted a an article called "The Death of Periodization," which in and of itself was not unusual. But what was unusual was that I then decided to put it on LinkedIn and we put it on Instagram. And once they were live, I thought it might be fun to dive into the debate. So several weeks later, what was interesting was that we had a little bit of a case study of what does this industry think about periodization debates, and it was a wild time. So it got me thinking about, I think, a common retort, which was like, why even debate this in the first place? Like, why are you guys even bringing up? Why would you question periodization, right? And it was asked enough times that I thought we should just write a blog post about that. We should dive into not only why we think periodization doesn't make sense in the tactical space, which is what the initial article was about, but why would we even want to have that debate in the first place? And so that's what this conversation really hones in on. And I think the overarching reason, or I should say the overarching, I think, justification for this conversation is that periodization and the science, which we'll get into, like the science that supports it, the sort of the social framework that really reinforces periodization is all built around a sports performance model that leads to a peak. So whether it's a game, a season, or in a lot of cases it's like a powerlifting meet, it doesn't matter what you're training for, but periodization in and of itself as a construct is designed to lead to a supposed outcome. And whether you realize it or not, the implication there is that we will take an athlete from A, they will improve, 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 improve until they get to B, and B will happen at a date and time of our choosing, the meet, the game, whatever. And that's fine. I think that in a world where you have a calendar, where you have events, where you have a performance that needs to happen on a specific date and time, you could make the case for forecasted outcomes, or pre-created sequences, or whatever you want to call them. Where this falls afoul in our world in tactical strength conditioning is that we're not peaking for anything, and I think that bothers a lot of people because they think that you need to peak for deployment. Well, that's odd because deployments, even on the short end, are still several months. And so to make the argument that you're going to peak an athlete across all facets of performance and they're then going to stay there for several months, it just doesn't hold any water. We're not having a conversation around optimum performance at a specific time. We're having a conversation around sustained performance inevitably. And in that space, periodization just doesn't work. So that kind of hopefully gets into some of the understanding of why we would even bring this conversation into the public forum in the first place. But the way that I kind of move through this justification in the article that accompanies this video is this kind of 5-step model. And this was based off of the debates that I got in. It was based off of some of the feedback that I got. But first and foremost, we have a conceptual problem, right? That I kind of just went through. It's built on shaky foundations at best. Like the foundations that underpin periodization are really kind of shaky. The research doesn't even validate what we think it validates. The other thing that was interesting, kind of the fourth point, is that everyone had their own definition of what periodization even was. So the concept itself has become so broad that you can't even separate it from coaching in the first place. For most of the detractors of the periodization article, the thought of programming without periodization, just the brain couldn't comprehend that could even be a thing. So then that raises kind of the fifth and final point, which is that what are we even defending in the first place? Like what are we actually doing here? And I just want to double down on something so that folks don't like come after me again. I'm not questioning whether or not coaches should plan. You should plan. You should program logically. You should be thinking ahead. You should have an idea of where your athlete is going. I think the bigger question and the why behind the debate in the first place is that has periodization become such a monolithic, unquestionable assumption that we can't even separate ourselves from it in the first place to actually objectively look at the athlete in front of us and make training decisions in real time. So let's work through these, right? The first reason why I wanted to debate this is that we're treating periodization like it's the only way to think. And that limits a lot of young coaches. And so to kind of illustrate that, you can conceptualize two coaches, right? Coach A is taught kind of the ways that we're all traditionally taught, which is I have this laundry list of periodization models. Depending on the athlete that I work with, I'm going to pick this one or this one or this one. Coach B isn't taught that way. Coach B is taught to just ask, what is the athlete showing me? Like, what information am I getting either objectively or subjectively from the athlete on the day to make the training decision? On the surface, I think people read that and just kind of brush over it and think, well, this, what's the difference? These are two fundamentally different coaching behaviors. Coach A, the one who's selecting from kind of the menu of periodization options, they've already gone into the problem or the athlete. They've already gone into that situation with a framework. They've already made decisions before they've even really gotten an understanding of the space that they're working with. The second coach is acting from a position of observation. And I think that what's interesting is that a lot of the coaches that disagreed with the periodization article kind of thought that they were operating from the observational platform. But in reality, just kind of based on the way their arguments played out or their counterpoints played out, they were very much already working from Coach A's viewpoint. They had their framework. They had already chosen their model, so to speak. And then they were just thinking that they were being observational because they decided to make a couple of changes down the road. That's not the same thing. Boxing yourself in at the beginning and then trying to create flexibility within that box is not the same thing as keeping all of your options open from the outset. There's a quote that I love, and I was pumped to be able to add it into this article. It's by Alfred Korzybski, and it says that the map is not the territory, right? And it's a useful idea from the philosophy of science. The map is not the territory. Periodization in this case is the map, right? It shows us where to go, but the athlete in front of us is the territory. So what they like, what they don't like, their stressors, either internal or external. The map itself is useful, but as soon as the map starts to prevent us from seeing the territory in front of us, it's lost its purpose in the first place. To me, that's a huge reason why we should have these debates, why we should question periodization, especially within an athletic paradigm like the tactical athlete paradigm, where it just doesn't make sense. It's not because planning in and of itself is bad, and you'll probably hear me say that many, many times. Planning is not bad. But there should never be a framework that we operate within that becomes so invisible to us that we stop even believing we can function without it. And if every young strength coach or every novice or new strength coach is coming into this space having already been told that they can only work within certain frameworks, or we don't even recognize that those frameworks exist, we're doing them a disservice by limiting their ability to be observational interpreters of the territory in front of them. The second reason why I think it's important to have this debate is something that we talked about on the podcast, and something that, quite frankly, I don't think it's talked about often enough, which is that the scientific foundation that underpins classical periodization has changed. We just haven't changed with it as an industry. And you'll hear me critique General Adaptation Syndrome. You'll hear me critique stress theory. The reality is that those are their own fields of research, right? All of the things that underpin periodization aren't exclusive to strength and conditioning. They come from other fields of research. General Adaptation Syndrome is not a theory from exercise science. It's a sort of stress physiology theory. Hans Selye introduced it decades ago, and it's no longer an accepted theory within that kind of world of stress science. But for some reason, we still cling to it as an underpinning mechanism for periodization. In fact, if you go on the National Strength and Conditioning Association's website and you look at the page that they have on periodization, it's referred to, General Adaptation Syndrome is referred to as a central concept, which is insane to think about because modern stress theory has completely moved on. And I'll give you some specific examples of this, right? In general adaptation syndrome, you've got your alarm resistance exhaustion curve, right? But Hans Selye kind of speaks to this non-specific response. And what he's arguing or what he's showing in his initial work is that every stressor, right, whether it's cold, heat, trauma, whether it's psychological, whether it's physical, whether it's a freaking back squat or a bench press, they all produce the exact same biological reaction. Exact same biological reaction. Everyone listening to this knows that that's not true. The modern understanding of stress shows that there are specific stress pathways and that our body's response to those different pathways vary significantly, whether it's a physical stress or a psychological stress. The other thing that I think is probably even more important is that Selye completely, and he acknowledges this, he completely ignored the sort of premeditator to stress or our cognitive appraisal of a perceived stressor, which sounds somewhat confusing until you start to think about it. Perception is everything. How you perceive a stress that you're about to enter into plays a massive role on the impact that that stress then has on your biology, psychology. The example that I use in the blog post is like a back squat, right? Like if I'm standing in front of a back squat, let's say it's 300 pounds, and I've already decided and started to tell myself that this is going to be heavy. I get under the bar, it's going to feel heavy. Conversely, if I'm able to introduce a lot of what we think of as cognitive performance, a lot of positive self-talk, maybe the music's pumping, maybe I convince myself that it's not going to feel heavy or whatever, that bar will feel lighter. We have all been there. We have all been under the barbell when it's the exact same weight. Sometimes it feels heavier, sometimes it feels lighter. A lot of that has to do with our perception of how it's going to feel. General adaptation syndrome does not account for perception in any way, shape, or form. What's interesting is that his framework, historically, his framework influenced those early theories of training adaptation because it suggested that people were responding, organisms or athletes in our case, were responding to stressors in predictable ways, right? If every single stress that you could possibly introduce to an organism is perceived the exact same way, which is what general adaptation syndrome says, well, then surely you can get away with predictive models of training adaptation because you know that no matter what you do, the athlete will follow that same curve. Again, the problem is that modern adaptation science has become dramatically more complex, and every coach should intrinsically know that, right? The athlete's rate of adaptation is influenced by things like genetics, like your sleep, like your training history, your nutrition, injury history, whether you're injured now, your motivation, what's going on in the environment around you. Adaptation is not a single stress response curve. It emerges from a complex interaction of biological, psychological, sociological, environmental constraints, right? That biopsychosocial model that we talked about. Hans Selye's work was never meant to be adapted to something that complex. Yet for some reason, even though that field of research has moved on from that model, within strength and conditioning, we still cling to it as an underpinning theory of adaptation. So, as I say in the article, it's not that general adaptation syndrome does not have any value whatsoever. Use it as sort of an introductory model. But if we have built our entire coaching philosophy upon something that is oversimplified and more importantly, outdated, we should start to be scrutinizing things, which leads me to the third point. Research supporting, quote unquote, supporting periodization more often than not actually just supports variation. And I'll give Alex a shout out here. He's always telling you, read the method section, read the method section, read the method section. This is how you can tease out whether a periodization study is actually testing the framework of that periodization model, or more often than not, it's comparing varied training against non-varied training. When you do that in these studies, predictably, the programs that vary the training stimulus outperform the programs that have the athletes complete the exact same workout over and over and over again. That should make obvious sense. But what I think is a little bit less obvious is asking yourself the question, does showing that varied training outperforms non-varied training prove that periodization works? Or does it show that variation is useful? You can add variation to training without periodizing. You can make adjustments to a training plan without forecasting 6, 12, 16 weeks down the road to predict what the athlete is going to do on a given day. There's a couple of papers that I've added into the post as resources that you guys can look into. I think Nunez and his colleagues have a great point. Many periodization studies never actually test the central claims of periodization. Instead, they're comparing the different methods of organizing variation while assuming that the underlying theory is already correct. So when we're looking at, for example, like block periodization versus non-varied training, there's an assumption that the periodization model is already correct. They're just now comparing variety to non-variety. Those are two very, very different things. The example again that I use in the article is like nutrition research, right? If we give a cohort a varied diet versus just giving them chicken breasts for every single meal, logically we would assume that the diet that has more variety would lead to healthier outcomes. It just, once you see that, you can't unsee it, and it's incredibly obvious. And again, like Alex says, just read the methods section and you should be able to tease that out. The fourth point is one that I think was probably the most frustrating when looking at all of these different debates that we engaged in online. There's a lot of coaches out there that can't even separate training from periodization. Like the two are synonymous, they mean the exact same thing. And I want to be very clear here. Training, and I'll use my own definition here, training is the process by which we as coaches take an athlete from a starting point to some future end state, right? So we have the athlete, we introduce stressors either directly or we try to account for stressors along the way using things like autoregulation and the other tools we talk about. We introduce stressors, we take them from current state to future state. That's training. Periodization is one of the many lenses through which we can view training. I think the key point, though, with periodization is that it gives us a framework for predicting hoped for outcomes far into the future. So, as I said in the article, as I said in my Art of Training piece, as I've said online, periodization, regardless of which type you choose, block, linear, undulating, triphasic, west side, yada, 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 they all operate from the same assumption, which is that you can forecast outcomes. You can peak. You can predetermine what an athlete will be capable of on some future date. You can dictate that. And then your job as a coach is just to make sure that the athlete stays as compliant as possible all the way, regardless of what else happens. That's periodization. Training, periodization. They are two different things. Periodization is a way in which we can choose to execute training. It is a way. You can use it. It is not the only way. And I was shocked how often that came up as a counter argument. I would provide a very straightforward point, and the counter argument would be, well, you're just periodizing. Like if you, and I quote these in the article, if you plan training, you're periodizing. If you adapt training in response to athlete feedback, that's also periodization. If you sequence training at all, that's periodization. Every coach periodizes. What was wild to me is that you would often see coaches saying something like, well, I was taught this particular model of periodization, but like you never stick to that dogmatically. Like you always make changes in response to how the athlete is, like you got to be flexible. So then my counter argument would be, and kind of the reason why I wrote this second article was like, okay, well then why are we teaching it as the only way to design training? Like why are we introducing into coaches this idea that we can forecast outcomes? There's really no response to that, right? Like what they were basically saying was periodization is everything. Okay. My counter argument would be, so do you never make changes? Oh, well, of course I make change. Like we don't actually stick to that place. Like, well, then what are we doing? The issue is that the concept of periodization has ballooned to the point where it apparently now includes everything. It includes planning, adaptation, progression, variation, sequencing, coaching. In some of the arguments that I engaged with, periodization just became an all-encompassing term for like any logical thought about training. If you were writing a training plan, you were periodizing. That is not true. I want to be very clear that from the outset of writing that article, the Death of Periodization article, the whole purpose was to critically examine periodization as a model for predicting and forecasting training outcomes. I was critiquing a model that is based upon predicting and forecasting training outcomes. Never was I trying to critique a vague catch-all term for the entire world of human performance. The goal was not to critique planning. The goal was not to critique coaching. I was not telling anyone that they should just randomly throw shit at the wall. I was distilling all of those different periodization models down to their central framework, which was a model for predicting and forecasting training outcomes. And I was critiquing that construct as whether or not it was appropriate for a tactical training environment. Now, I'll reference another scientist here, Karl Popper. He argues that scientific theories must expose themselves to the possibility of being wrong. So if every counterexample that I provide just gets reclassified as another form of periodization, you can't test or falsify the concept anymore, and it's bad science. So that's not evidence that periodization is false necessarily, but it does suggest whether or not we should ask, has this become so broad that it no longer helps us to think clearly? Which gets into my last point, the fifth point, why we brought up the debate against periodization in the first place. If nobody can define it, then what exactly are you all defending, right? Everyone has their own definition of what periodization even is. Everyone claims to support it, but nobody can actually agree on what it truly means, right? And what was, I think, annoying was that I've defined periodization here. I defined it in the article. I defined it on the podcast. I'm still being told online that I haven't defined periodization, which is wild to me. Like, just read the content before you engage in a debate. The quote that I will use, this is the quote that I put in the Death of Periodization argument or article, the way I define it. The fundamental assumption of periodization is this: if we manipulate training variables in predetermined ways over predetermined periods, predictable biological adaptations will occur on a predictable schedule. If we manipulate training variables in predetermined ways. So for example, if I chart out 6, 12, 18 weeks of training, if I manipulate those training variables over a predetermined period, i.e. into the future, the assumption that I'm making is that predictable biological adaptations will occur on that schedule. That is what I was critiquing. That's how I define periodization. That's how every model effectively frames periodization. It's not a critique on planning. It's not a critique on programming. It's not a critique on coaching. But if you just take a second and compare all of this periodization literature, they're all basically saying the same thing, right? Matveyev, he talks about long-term sequencing based on predictable adaptations. Bompa, he emphasizes systematic planning towards peak performance. Isurin emphasizes concentrated loading. The NSCA, as we mentioned in the podcast, defines it pretty broadly as the logical sequencing and integration of training interventions. All of those things lead back to that fundamental assumption: the manipulation of training variables in predetermined ways over predetermined periods, predictable biological adaptations will occur on a predictable schedule, right? What's happening here is that many coaches are simply just describing it as good planning. But if you read any of the critical periodization literature, the literature that critiques periodization, there's a recognition that what we're going after is predictive adaptation models. You can have good planning without predicting outcomes. And I'll show you guys how to do that in future content. Those are not small semantic differences, right? These are fundamentally different concepts. Planning and forecasting are fundamentally different concepts. But if the definition of periodization changes every time somebody challenges it, we can't have any kind of meaningful discussion. You have to be able to agree on a definition of what it means before you can have a scientific, educated, high-level debate on whether or not it makes sense for this population. So I kind of close the article with this, right? The biggest reason, maybe perhaps the biggest reason to debate periodization is simply that science progresses by refining ideas until they become more precise, right? We only move forward as an industry insofar as we're able to debate ideas and refine ideas to where they get more precise. We don't move forward if we protect vague ideas from criticism, if we don't even allow criticism to exist in the first place. And so to ask the question, why criticize? Those are the 5 reasons that I've just mentioned here. First and foremost, we're treating periodization as the only way to think, and that limits young coaches. Secondly, the scientific foundation of classical periodization doesn't even exist anymore. 3, the research that allegedly supports periodization is actually just showing that variation is better than stagnation. 4, coaches in many cases aren't even able to separate the idea of training from the idea of periodization. And then 5, if nobody can even define it, what exactly are we even defending? So again, it's been a wild ride. I have thoroughly enjoyed putting this content out there. I have thoroughly enjoyed engaging with all of you, as frustrating as it might be sometimes. My hope is that we can have more of these conversations. My hope is that I can record more of these videos to give a little bit more context to the stuff that I'm writing. If you guys enjoyed this, let us know, and we will see you in the next post.